All right. So thank you for joining me today. For those of you who don't know, I guess probably all of you do, my name is Matt Pelikan, and I'm a community naturalist with BiodiversityWorks in Vineyard Haven. The origin of this presentation was last fall when my friend Janet Woodcock stopped by, and Janet has been involved, well, she's a serious gardener in addition to being a naturalist, and has become involved in the seed library that is run out of the West Tisbury Library, which is a seed exchange program that kind of prioritizes vegetable seeds and heirloom ornamentals and native plant seeds. And she wanted to talk about pollinators and see if I could give her any advice on what kinds of plants were particularly important for pollinators. And of course, the answer that I always give to a question like that is, well, how long do you want me to talk for? Because it's an incredibly complicated question. We talked about some of the ins and outs of pollinators and growing plants for pollinators, and concluded that the thing to do was to set up a presentation. So I gave a presentation at the West Tisbury Library at the beginning of February, which was pretty well attended and I think pretty well received. And so we decided it was worth re-editing that presentation a little bit and doing it this evening as a webinar for eventually posting on our website. So I am going to talk about pollinators, and maybe from a slightly different perspective than people are used to thinking about it. We are familiar with flowers. They've been around for a very, very long time, roughly 130 million years, and they are flowering plants are really one of the dominant types of life on the planet Earth now, with as many as 400,000 species present. I like this picture of an ancient, basically an ancient buttercup from the fossil record. So that's what they look like back in those days. But I want to back up even a little bit farther than that in evolutionary terms and just mention that sexual reproduction was an enormously powerful innovation in the evolution of life on Earth. And basically going from just splitting yourself in two or breaking off a piece of yourself and creating another organism that way, to take pieces of two different organisms that have half the number of chromosomes that the finished product is going to, and then putting them together. It works in a couple of really important ways. The first is that it sort of protects against mutations that are harmful. If the DNA of one of those organisms has changed, there will be a second copy of the gene to replace that damaged bit of DNA. But also by combining two genetic material from two organisms, you end up with the ability to experiment some. So it really accelerated the pace of evolution and allowed species to experiment with different kinds of modifications to try to improve their suitability. And of course, I'm talking like they're doing it deliberately, but it's simply happening by random mutation and just the biological processes of things surviving to reproduce or not surviving. But once you get the idea of having to get genetic material from two organisms together in order to produce the next generation, you run into the problem of how to get the genetic material together. And it's not so hard if you're animals. You can walk around and court, or you can have singles bars or dating applications or whatever. But if you're an immobile flower, it's a little bit more challenging. And the way that it originally happened, presumably, was that plants simply dumped their genetic material out into the environment to be moved around by wind or possibly water. And that works, but it's kind of a random way of doing things. And it's very, very inefficient that you have to produce a lot of pollen if you're going to hit your target. So that's why when wind-pollinated plants like pine trees start to dump their pollen in the spring, you end up with a 1/4 inch of it spread on your porch. It's just because they have to produce so much of the stuff. And with flowers, which started to evolve, here we go. as organs specifically to attract insects to sort of be assistants in moving that pollen around. And that allows much more targeted and much more efficient pollination or fertilization to take place. So flowers produce two main resources, and it varies, how much they produce of these and so forth varies, what exactly they consist of varies. But the rule is that they produce both nectar, which is a compound produced precisely just to attract insects. And it's a mix of water and usually chemicals like sugar and sometimes amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, of course. So it's there to attract insects. It gives them a little treat if they visit the flower, and it's an incentive for the insects to visit. And then flowers also produce pollen, of course, which are little grains that contain the male gametes, the reproductive material. And they're usually wrapped in pollen and sometimes other substance. So they also have nutritional value. And in ecological terms, it's useful to remember that both nectar and pollen can be depleted over the short term. So if there is a huge amount of pollinator activity, for example, if a bunch of honeybees descend on a patch of flowers, they can pick it clean. The supply will get replenished over time, but for the short term at least, these are resources that can be exhausted. And that means that there is, in addition to the relationship going on between plants and insects, there is a competitive relationship going on between insects and other insects about who is going to get the goodies, who's going to displace the other one from a flower and so forth. So already this idea of pollination is starting to acquire some ecological complications. The way people generally get taught about pollination, though I think the way we tend to think about it, is that it's a really synergistic thing, really cooperative thing that plants and pollinators work together to produce a diverse community, and that the more pollinators you have, the more plants you'll have, and the more plants you have, the more pollinators you have, and so a rising tide lifts all boats. And there's not really anything wrong with that model. It's just that it's a little bit oversimplified. It turns out there's much more going on with pollinators and the pollination relationship. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. This, incidentally, the picture is one of the test plots from a 3-year pollinator study that I worked on 8 vineyard farms over the last few years. This was one of our test plots at Whippoorwill Farm. And I'll be making reference to that study a couple of times in the course of this presentation. It's important to remember that as important as pollination is, it's only one facet of the lives of either the plants or the insects that are involved. So there's a whole bunch of ecology that has nothing to do with the transfer of pollen, but that is really important to these organisms. Plants obviously need to have enough light and enough water and suitable soil pH and so forth. And insects have a lot of requirements as well, including nesting and overwintering sites. And they engage in an incredibly complicated network of relationships with competitors and predators and parasites. So as important as pollination is, it's really only part of the story. And if you want to think about pollination and boosting pollinators in your yard, simply planting flowers isn't going to really do the job there. I mean, it'll do part of the job, but if you're really serious about encouraging insects and other pollinators, you need to think about the full life cycle of those insects. And a really good example is this bee, Calides inequalis. And it's a female leaving her nest. And you can see the soil that she's nested in is a rather coarsely textured sand. And that seems to be what this species likes, at least on Martha's Vineyard. So no matter how many flowers there are around, Calides inequalis isn't going to be able to carry out its full life cycle unless it also has a suitable substrate for nesting in. So that's just an important point to keep in mind. A good example of that, of this kind of complexity and the way it kind of radiates out, would be this bee on the left, a specimen of Calides productus. And it's a relatively rare bee. I call it infrequently reported in my notes there, but it probably is fairly rare. Just because something's is reported infrequently doesn't necessarily mean it is rare. So I'm always kind of hesitant to use words like rare when what I really mean is people don't see it very often. In this case, I think it genuinely is a pretty rare bee. And it's a very, very closely associated with a particular plant, pretty much the only thing that it nectars on. So that's one very close relationship. But it also has, as I've implied, other kinds of relationships, including with this other bee, which is Epiolus inernatus. And that's what we call a cuckoo bee. They lay their eggs in the nests of other bee species. The cuckoo bee never collects any pollen or anything. She's just what they call a kleptoparasite, laying her eggs in the nest of another species. And when the cuckoo bee eggs hatch, they eat the provisions that the other bee species has laid up for its young, and sometimes it eats the larvae as well. So very important ecological consideration if you're a bee. And it's just an example of how we've got a rare bee that's highly specialized and depends on one particular plant. Excuse me. And then we've got an also very rare bee that is totally dependent on that first rare bee. So very, very complicated ecological relationships going on here. It's important to remember in thinking about pollinator and plant relationships that as much as there is a sort of synergistic or cooperative relationship at the long-term and community-wide and evolutionary perspective, the interests diverge a little bit on the level of individual species and individual, the lifespans of individual insects. The nectar and the pollen that flowers are producing are resource intensive. They take chemicals that could be used for other things in that plant's life, like the amino acids that go into nectar could be using to produce pollen, to produce vegetative growth, protein and vegetative growth for the plant. So plants don't really want to produce any more nectar or pollen than they really need to get the job done. And from that perspective, if plants could invent their own pollinators, they'd come up with an insect that didn't take any pollen for its own use, but delivered 100% of the pollen that it collected to conspecific flowers. Of course, that doesn't happen, and the pollinators are actually visiting the flowers for themselves. They want to get nectar, they want to get pollen for themselves or for their young. And they want to do it as efficiently as possible because insects tend to be living on very, very tight time budgets with a lot of things they need to do in their lives and not a lot of opportunity to do that. So pollination, carrying pollen from one plant to another, one flower to another, doesn't do any harm. There's nothing wrong with it from the insect's perspective. But that's not what it's really interested in doing. What it's really interested in doing is collecting pollen and nectar, and the plants are on their own as far as the insect is concerned. So evolution has really gone to town with this divergence of interests, and a lot of really interesting things have evolved as a result of it. One thing is that in addition to attracting insects that pollinate them, flowers attract a lot of things that have nothing to do with pollination. Flowers are resources. They have intrinsic value in that if you eat them, they're pretty nutritious. And because they attract insects, they can be a concentration of prey items if you're a predatory arthropod. So an example of that would be this northern crab spider, which has snagged a blowfly of some kind. I think it's a Ballardia. And it's noteworthy that this particular spider really likes goldenrod, and it even has evolved coloration so that it blends in very well on a goldenrod flower. And that's a good choice because goldenrod is a really immense pollinator magnet. I'm going to talk a lot about it today. I'm a real big goldenrod booster. And the choice of this as a hunting ground for this crab spider is not random. They use this plant because it attracts a lot of potential prey, and they've evolved to use it very efficiently, hiding but with protective coloration and waiting in ambush. This is a grasshopper eating a flower, and I don't think grasshoppers ever really perform pollination exactly, but I watched this grasshopper crawled up and perched on an aster blossom and proceeded to eat a series of the petals, the ray petals, by starting at the end and just munching its way down to the disc of the flower and shifting its position and starting on another petal and eating that one up too. So no pollination going on here. The flower is simply being wrecked by something that came to feed on it, doing the plant no good at all. In fact, it's doing harm, but it obviously is working out pretty well for the grasshopper. I don't know how often grasshoppers eat flowers. It's not a behavior I've seen terribly often, but I've seen it often enough, so I think it may actually be an ecologically fairly important thing. So there are a couple of ways that plants can handle the question of how to get pollinated adequately. And at one extreme, you can simply say, well, we want our flowers to be as welcoming as possible. We're going to come up with a flower design, evolve a flower design that's really accessible and has really yummy nectar and easily collected and easily digested pollen. And we're going to have flower clusters that are easy to spot and have a strong chemical signature. And we're just going to invite everybody in the neighborhood over. And of course, the result is that a lot of your pollen then is going to get wasted because you're just inviting everything in, and who knows where they're going to fly off after they've landed on you. But if you have enough visitors, you can be reasonably sure that at least some of that pollen is going to end up in an appropriate place on one of your conspecifics where it can pollinate and fertilize the other flower and facilitate reproduction. So some plants, some flowers really cater to a broad spectrum of pollinators and other visitors, and they just trust in the fact that that's going to work out for them in the end. A good example of that would be butterfly weed, which is the flower in this picture. And the kind of pollinator that turns up on a flower like that is often something like this spheccid wasp, Spex ignominius. This is a wasp that has no particular modifications for feeding on pollen, so it can't handle difficult flower shapes. But you can see it's pretty easy to stick your schnoz down into one of the individual flowers on this head of butterfly weed and eat or drink nectar or eat the contents of that flower. And again, you talk about radiating webs of relationships. This particular wasp is a predator on small katydids for the most part. So it plays a role in regulating Orthoptera populations. And the females dig a nest and they sting and paralyze a katydid, and they haul it down into the nest and they lay an egg on it. And the egg hatches underground and feeds itself on the way to maturity by eating that paralyzed prey. So, again, this is a pollinator, but it's also an insect that has connections that go far beyond that. Four-banded stink hunter, these are another beneficial insect. They take a lot of stink bugs and also things like the western conifer seed bug, which is technically a leaf-footed bug, not a stink bug, but I think they provision their nests with that too. And again, the flower here with small, easily accessed, shallow flowers, Pycnanthemum tenuifolium, is a pollinator magnet, and you can find all kinds of things visiting it, not just this wasp, but it's not uncommon to find, 8 or 10 species of insects visiting just one flower head of this plant. And a lot of flies are also very generalist pollinators that have sort of limited ability to feed on difficult flowers. if you look at this Aristolus arvistorum, you can kind of see the mouth part here, and it's what I like to refer to as a sponge on a straw model. It's a very common mouth part type in flies. And it really can't penetrate deep into, for example, a tubular flower. But it's really good with flowers like these fennel blossoms. So you find a lot of flies and a lot of wasps on flower heads like this with small, shallow blossoms. And some of them will carry pollen that will reach another blossom, and some of them will fly off and do something entirely different. But in the end, enough pollination occurs for the plant to be happy. And the other extreme from just opening the door is invitation only. And a lot of flowers have taken the approach of limiting access in one way or another. They make it hard to get into the flower. They make it maybe require a particular kind of behavior on the part of the insect in order for it to be able to forage successfully. They may make the evolve pollen grains that are really difficult to handle. They may be large and sticky and have spines on them like goldenrod, and not everything can handle goldenrod pollen successfully. And the goal here is obviously not to prevent pollination, which would be the last thing that the plant would want, but rather to encourage efficiency in pollination. It's to limit the numbers of the kinds of pollinators that are visiting you. And so those will be the ones that will, because they are familiar with you, will visit other flowers of the same kind and transfer pollen much more efficiently with a lot less waste. And so that's beneficial from the flower's perspective. It speaks to the efficiency end of things. This can play out in some really bizarre ways. This is an example of the pink lady slipper, the flower really just kind of putting down a royal flush and saying, beat that to all the pollinators. They produce these wonderful, colorful flowers, and they produce a wonderful, delicate scent. And a bee or something comes up and it says, this looks like a great resource, and it finds the entrance and it squeezes its way in. But lady slippers don't produce any nectar. And the pollen that they produce is up on the top of the flower and not easy to find when you go in there. So the bee turns around and says, oh, this is terrible. This is the worst bar I've ever been to. And it pushes its way out. But on the process of doing that, it inevitably picks up some pollen on its body as it exits the flower. And of course, bees are not necessarily all that bright. They're really brilliant at being bees, but they don't necessarily learn from one single experience. So a few minutes later, they find another lady slipper, and looks pretty. It smells great. They think this is going to be terrific, and they go inside, and the same thing happens. And so this is an example of pollinators tricking plants tricking pollinators. So there is benefit for the plant, but none for the insect, which is a reversal from the way things usually happen. This is not my photo. I wish it were, but a pretty spectacular bee with the metallic green coloration and that prodigious tongue, which is much longer than the overall body of the insect. And it's an example of a bee that has evolved an anatomy for reaching into long tubular orchid flowers down in the tropics, the neotropics, to drink nectar there. And probably as it inserts, you can even see there are some hairs on the tongue. And as it inserts the tongue into the flower to drink the nectar, it probably is picking up pollen grains, which it will then carry to the next orchid it visits. So an example of a very, very specialized relationship with a highly modified anatomy on the part of both the orchid and the bee. We have a lot of flowers that are kind of tubular in shape. Some of them are exotics, like the garden phlox, the Phlox paniculata, that a tiger swallowtail is feeding on in the lower right. But even a plant like blueberry has a flower, that bell-shaped flower, that is deep enough so not everything can feed on it effectively. And we have there a hummingbird moth, which, like a lot of other Lepidoptera, has a very, very long proboscis that it can insert into flowers to drink the nectar from the base. And in this case, it probably is not going to pick up any pollen. It's simply stealing nectar from the flower, doing no good at all to the flower, but getting a drink for the insect. So it's a jungle out there, and there really is a sort of evolutionary battle going on between plants and insects. Insects can develop behavioral modifications. These are instinctive ones. They're probably inherited, but a number of bees practice when they don't have the apparatus for reaching into a bell-shaped or tubular flower. They develop a behavioral workaround, which is to bite a hole and go in from the side and get to the nectar at the base of the flower that way. And you can see the mandibles of this female carpenter bee just chomping that flower, and she's then going to move into position and insert her tongue into the base of the flower. Again, no pollination is going to come out of that. All that's happening is this bee is getting a drink of nectar. So she is nectar robbing. This is a native bee, a male Colletes inequalis, doing the same thing. And this was an interesting process to watch in comparison to the carpenter bee, which has very powerful mandibles and just grabs that flower and gives it a chomp. The Colletes did a much more surgical operation using delicate pointed mandibles to kind of snip along in a row, cutting a little slot. And then it uses its mandibles to spreads the mandibles out and opens up a little slot that it can insert its tongue into. So this is also nectar robbing in a somewhat more delicate and artistic, I would say, manner. Another way that plants can discourage unwanted visitors is by developing toxicity. An example would be sheep laurel, Calmia angustifolia, which is a very, very common plant in sort of barrens and wetland edge settings on the vineyard. The pollen is mildly toxic, and a lot of insects don't seem to be very successful at collecting it, perhaps because it tastes bad, or just they actually feel ill effects from handling it. But this bee, Andrena calmii, has evidently developed a biochemistry that allows it to neutralize the toxins in Calmia angustifolia. And this is pretty much the only plant that this bee will ever visit for pollen. And you can see that this female has got a monumental pollen load. She's been working hard, is carrying pollen. She's also got grains of pollen scattered all over her body. So she's doing very, very effective pollination for this, and she's feeding herself and her offspring very effectively. But there are relatively few species of bees that are capable of doing what she's doing. So she is highly optimized for a very, very specialized role in the environment. Interesting to think about the distribution of sheep laurel, Calmia angustifolia, on Martha's Vineyard. And this is just records from the community science platform iNaturalist. Each one of those pins is where the plant has been recorded. And this is iNaturalist records for the bee, Andrena calmii. And you'll note that it occupies only a very, very small percentage of what a human being would think of is the appropriate habitat. I don't really know why that is. I've looked for it in a lot of places. I've looked in Corellis. I've looked around here. I've looked in some other places south of the West Tisbury Road here, and I simply can't find it. So something is going on. It may have to do with soil types, because this is a ground nesting bee. It may have to do with the microclimate on the South Shore, that for some reason might be either beneficial for the bee, or perhaps it's harmful for something that's an enemy to the bee. Like it may prevent some bacterial infection from getting started. I mean, who knows? It could be any of a number of things. But for whatever reason, in addition to being very specialized on this plant, Andrena calmii is very specialized in terms of where it occurs on the vineyard. And the specialization goes beyond that. This is a fly I'd like to talk about very briefly. It's Myopa virginica. And the whole canopid family, this is a canopid fly, Canopidae. They are parasites on bees. And what they do is they grapple with a female bee in flight and they pry up the segments, one of the segments of the female bee's abdomen, and they quickly whip an egg under there, which then hatches and eats the bee from the inside out. And as a photographer, I have to say it's better to be lucky than good. This is not a shot that I thought I was going to get, but I happened to pull the trigger at the right time, showing this Myopa virginica attacking an Andronacalmii in the air. So this is a rare specialized bee, and it has a rare specialized parasite that lives there too. So again, radiations out into the broader ecology of a site. It's not just plants and pollinators, it's plants and pollinators plus everything that they interact with in this grand complicated web of things. Now, I will talk about bees a lot simply because bees are my current obsession, but it's important to remember that lots of other things visit flowers and often function as pollinators. And I mentioned that 3-year study of farm insects that was run by the Betsy and Jesse Fink Family Foundation with BiodiversityWorks doing the science component. And we found a really high diversity, I would say, of insects visiting flowers on the 8 farms that were participating. 300 species that we could identify. There were undoubtedly a lot more that we couldn't. And just a very, very high diversity. 5 insect orders were pretty well represented and 5 other orders in smaller numbers visiting flowers. Not all of those were pollinators, like the grasshopper that we looked at earlier. Some of them were visiting the spider. Some of them were visiting flowers for other reasons. But it's clear that, that farms are really good pollinator and insect habitat, and the floral resources there are ecologically very powerful. We found a lot of representatives of the order Diptera, the flies, including a lot of syrphid flies or hover flies or flower flies like this one. A lot of these are bee mimics or wasp mimics with coloration that makes them look like a wasp. And a lot of them, this one doesn't, but a lot of syrphid flies have predatory larvae. A lot of them feed on aphids. So they're beneficial to have around a garden or around a farm. And this is one of the benefits of attracting a lot of pollinators. And one group within the order Diptera that are really well adapted for feeding on flowers are the bee flies. And you can see in the upper right, this Bombilius species, I think it's Bombilius mexicanus, has got a really long proboscis that looks menacing, but is a totally harmless organ. It's purely for reaching into flowers, just as in the same way that if people could mute themselves, that would be much appreciated. So it's an adaptation for feeding on flowers that this particular genus has in a pretty big way. This is an early season tachinid fly. Tachinidae is a big fly family, the larvae of which are all endoparasites on other arthropods. That means they are parasites that live inside the body of other insects and other arthropods. Often they're pretty specific relationships. This particular fly, its larvae live in cutworm caterpillars. And this is a fly, it's very, very common out in Barron's habitat on the vineyard. And I find it all the time around bearberry, often visiting flowers and trying to take nectar and pollen from the flowers. And I don't often find bees on bearberry. So I suspect that this fly is actually probably the most important pollinator for bearberry on the vineyard. We think of bees being the most effective pollinators, and indeed, as a group, they are. But there are lots of situations, individual cases where something else is better than any bee is, and that may be one of them. Beetles, the order Coleoptera, are very common on flowers. This is the locust borer. The larvae live in locust trees, but the adults feed on pollen. And again, they've got coloration that probably helps them stay hidden on goldenrod, which is one of their favorite plants. There is an entire subfamily of the longhorn beetle family called Lepturinae, which are sometimes called the flower longhorn beetles, like this one, Typocerus velutinus, that again spend their entire adult lives pretty much feeding on flowers. Their larvae do a bunch of various things, different lifestyles, but the adults are generally found on flowers, and that's what they feed on, and they can function as pollinators. And Rhipiphoridae is another beetle family, not too many representatives on the island, but you're never going to see the adults of this family anywhere other than on a flower, unless it's some kind of really bizarre accident. They just spend their whole lives hanging out there. So this is a good example of that. The order Lepidoptera, of course, butterflies and moths, is highly evolved to feed on flowers. They have this wonderful proboscis here, which they can control with great dexterity. They can use it to feed on, take nectar out of both shallow and very deep tubular flowers. They really handle it with incredible accuracy and control. This is a tawny-edged skipper feeding on thyme. And a lot of, if you're thinking about augmenting pollinator resources in your yard, a lot of the herbs like thyme and oregano and cilantro, when they bloom, are very, very good pollinator plants. So I will just plant that idea there. And this is a pest moth, Helicoverpa zea, the corn earworm. And again, you can see it's got a pretty good proboscis for getting into flowers, and it's on Agastache here. But what I really want to talk about is bees. And we're going to look at some instances of particular bees that are doing curious things on the vineyard. It's interesting that in evolutionary terms, the first bees turn up in the fossil record not very long after the first flowers do. So the idea of not just visiting flowers as a happenstance kind of thing, but actually specializing into a taxonomic group that is evolved specifically for visiting flowers happened very, very quickly in evolutionary terms after the flowers appeared. There isn't a lot of high-level diversity. There are only 7 families of bees in the world. But they're pretty speciose families. So there are as many as 20,000 bee species worldwide, and 204 of them have been documented on the vineyard, which is probably a lot more than most of you expect, unless I bent your ear on the subject previously. Bees evolved from a family of wasps called Crebronidae, the Crebronid or square-headed wasps, which are predatory. They're like that sphesid wasp that we looked at earlier, that they capture arthropods and they bring them into a below-ground nest. And this is just an example. Again, it's Epiolus inornatus and Tachytes on the right, which is a Crebronid wasp. I just put these 2 photos in to show how similar some bees can be to some Crebronids. So you really see the evolutionary heritage of bees in a comparison like this. They're really pretty similar. Hats off to Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, which is incredibly common is just all. If you could please mute yourselves, everybody, I would appreciate it. Incredibly abundant bee on Martha's Vineyard. It occurs in pretty much every habitat. It will nest even in yards and places like that with a fairly degraded ecological condition. And it has a very long season. The first ones appear late April, beginning of May, and they're on the wing until sometimes November. So they're here for pretty much the whole growing season. And they are incredible generalists. They will visit almost any kind of flower to forage on it. This one happens to be on clover. But that farm project documented the species using about 50 species, the species of bee using about 50 species of flowers. So this is an example of the extreme generalist end of the spectrum in the bee department. Very important ecologically. One neat thing that bumblebees can do that a lot of other bees, including honeybees, cannot do is what's called buzz pollinating. And I mentioned flowers sometimes requiring behavioral modifications if you're going to access the goodies. And blueberries are an example of that. They hold their pollen quite tightly, and it's hard to dislodge it. But bumblebees have the knack of perching on a flower and then just sort of putting it in neutral and giving it some gas. And their wings vibrate and buzz, and that vibration shakes the pollen loose and makes it easier to collect. And this Bombus bimaculatus is doing precisely that on a blueberry blossom outside my house a couple of years ago. The sweat bees, the family Halictidae, are a very, very large and important family. They're pretty much all generalists. They will visit a wide range of things, although there are some specialists in the family. This one, Halictus legatus, is a pretty common one, and it's visiting a native aster. This is an example of another genus in that family, Lasioglossum, which is very, very well represented on the vineyard. It's a huge genus. It's a nightmare for identification, but at least 37 species in this genus occur on the vineyard, including this Lasioglossum fusipenni, a female collecting aster blossoms. So they are generalists, but being part of being a generalist means that you also visit a lot of flowers that have specialists associated with them. So we're going to see we have a lot of goldenrod and aster specialists, but goldenrods and asters are also visited by generalists like Lasioglossum fusipenni. And I think specialization is one of those things that is really underestimated, or maybe even not even known about by a lot of people. But it's a pretty common thing in the bee world, with about a quarter of our species being more or less specialized for some subset of plant taxa, and can be very, very specific. We mentioned one example earlier where the Calides productus visited Lyonia, and another one where Andrena calmii visits sheep laurel. In other cases, it might be visiting a family or plants in a particular genus. But in any case, there's some degree of specialization. And you might think that's a bad thing in evolutionary terms. You know, why limit yourself? There are zillions of kinds of flowers out there. Why write off 95% of those flower species when you could be visiting them? But obviously, it wouldn't have happened. This wouldn't have evolved if there weren't advantages to it. And there are pretty considerable ones because specialization allows you to become really efficient and really dedicated. You get to develop anatomical traits that make you very efficient at working with that kind of plant. You may even develop behavioral characteristics that help your reproduction, because if both males and females like to visit the same species of plant, they're going to tend to concentrate in a limited area where that plant occurs, and that will make it easier for males and females to find each other. So there are a lot of reasons why specialization is a good strategy rather than the bad one that you might think it would be just off the cuff. And this can have some pretty interesting implications for pollination. This is a very small spring flying bee called Andrena melanocrua. The females are about 7 millimeters, 6 millimeters long, and the males are a little bit smaller, about 5 to 6. And while it visits a number of plants, it has a particular fondness for strawberry blossoms, like the one in the bottom of this slide. And in a really elegant study that I read, researchers found that the the suite of native pollinators, including bees like Andrena melanochrua, are much more efficient at pollinating commercial strawberries than honeybees are. And a lot of farmers will import honeybees to do their pollination for them. And it turns out that that's really a bad idea in this case. And the deal is that when a honeybee, which is a pretty good sized bee, lands on top of one of these flowers, it lumbers around and knocks pollen off, and the flower self-pollinates, which strawberry flowers are capable of doing. But when one of these little native bees lands on the flower, it's much more delicate in its behavior, and it picks up some pollen, it takes some nectar, and it picks up pollen on its body and carries it away, but it doesn't tend to dislodge the pollen. So it doesn't promote self-pollination to the extent that honeybees do. Now, the funny thing about strawberries is that they can, as I said, they can both self-pollinate and cross-pollinate, but fruit that come from self-pollinated flowers generally are smaller and more poorly formed, both undesirable characteristics in a commercial operation. So the native bees, if you're interested in producing high-quality strawberries, the native bees are much, much more effective pollinators than honeybees are. Neat biology. You don't often think about what it feels like to walk around on a flower if you're a bee. But that's an example of how that very, very physical interaction between a pollinator and the flower turns out to be a really important thing. We have a lot of bees here that are specialized on blueberries. And one of the characteristics I mentioned earlier of blueberries is a fairly deep bell-shaped flower. And a lot of times you find bees that are adapted to feeding on blueberry have evolved a kind of elongated face, like this female Andrena bradleyi. The male in the inset picture has a much shorter face and actually has very different feeding habits. The males emerge much earlier than the females do, and about the only thing that seems to be in bloom when the males start flying is willows. And you find male Andrena bradleyi on willows, and then a few weeks after they come out, the females emerge and they turn up on blueberries, putting that elongated face to good use. Calides validus is another blueberry specialist with an elongated face. In this case, both the males and females have a really elongated face just to stuff into the flowers of blueberries. Melita melitoides, we're in a different family now. And this is an example of a very, very highly specialized bee. They pretty much feed exclusively on Lionia ligostrina, maleberry, and they're very highly evolved for it. They actually have anatomical modifications for hanging upside down like that bee in the upper left. They've got really robust middle legs with strong musculature, so they can hang by it for a long period of time. And you can see in that central photo on the bottom that the mandibles on the females of this species are extremely long. Those are the two prongs forking out from the female's face in this picture. And that's because Lionia is a relative of blueberries, and you can kind of see the flower shape. Again, it's a bell-shaped flower with a very narrow entrance. So the, sorry, that was just a text coming in from my wife who was at her bowling league right now, and she just got a strike. Happy to hear that. So the flowers are very, very difficult to feed on with that restricted opening. And the way that the Melita feeds on Lionia is by inserting those long mandibles into the flower and shaking pollen loose and extracting it from the flower and then sweeping it back onto the pollen carrying hairs on the hind legs, where you have a little waxy blob like that bee in the upper right hand picture has. So this is an example of extreme behavioral and anatomical modification for specialization. This is the only flower it feeds on pretty much, and it probably wouldn't even be able to feed on a lot of flowers because of its modifications. Very, very fine degree of evolution here. Grateful to Sharon Britton for this specimen, Andrena cornelli. And this is a bee, this is a female, and you can see the pollen-carrying hairs on the legs are really long and they're unforked. They're very simple hairs, very different from a lot of other bees show. And that's an adaptation for carrying the pollen of azaleas and rhododendrons, the grains of which are very, very large and very sticky. So this is a hair modification designed for carrying a particular kind of pollen. So goldenrods and asters are among the most important plants for pollinators on the vineyard, and they are supportive of a wide range of generalist pollinators and a wide range, as we saw with that crab spider earlier, of non-pollinators that visit flowers. And if you want to really boost the ecological value of your yard, planting native goldenrods and asters, preferably more than one species of each, is a great way to start. I guarantee that you will find all kinds of things visiting these. And we're just going to finish up here by ripping through a bunch of examples. This is Andrena hirticincta, which is a common and widespread and easily recognized Andrena with these broad hair bands. Turns up on a lot of things, including asters, but I found it on probably 5 or 6 goldenrod species and 3 or 4 aster species. So it's a little bit of a generalist, but also a specialist because it confines itself to one family. Andrena asteris is another Andrena that focuses more on asters than on goldenrod. It's probably on a cultivar of New England aster here. I don't know exactly what it is. But you can see she's collecting pollen very, very effectively with those full load of pollen. And she's also well dusted with pollen grains all over her body because pollination is what bees do. Andrena bricata is a relatively uncommon Andrena on the vineyard. It is a strong goldenrod specialist. I've never seen it on anything else. And like a lot of other goldenrod specialists, it has a particular fondness for seaside goldenrod, Solidago sempervirens. So if you want a specific goldenrod species recommendation, this is a good one. It blooms late, so you want to complement it with an early season goldenrod or two, but it is the magical flower late in the season in late September and early October, everywhere it occurs on Martha's Vineyard. Another genus, the genus Calides, which is represented by 9 species on Martha's Vineyard. And 5 of those, I should say that 8 of those 9 are specialists of one form or another, and 5 of them are specialists on goldenrods. You sometimes find some of them on asters, but Calides compactus, seen here, is almost always on goldenrod. Calides simulans, you might think these are pretty similar species, but if you look closely at this bee, and if you can see where my cursor is, there's a little prong sticking out here. That's called a prenodal spine, and it actually is a really handy, this species doesn't have it, and this species does, so it's a really handy field mark if you can find it. Calides simulans and Calides compactus tend to have the same seasonality on the vineyard and exactly the same preferences, and they turn up in exactly the same places. I'm sure there are ecological differences between the two of them, but I don't know really what they are. And then yet another Calides goldenrod specialist, the rare to uncommon Calides americanus, once again on Solidago sempervirens. Phenology really matters. This is another goldenrod specialist, Calides solidaginus, but it flies earlier in the season than those 3 Calides that we just looked at. And because it flies earlier, it has a different selection of goldenrods to choose from. This bee probably never even has the opportunity to feed on Solidago sempervirens, but it uses Solidago odora, which is one of our earliest goldenrods. And Andrena nubecula is another example of that, an early season goldenrod specialist that usually ends up on an early goldenrod, Solidago odora. This is a late August, early September species on the vineyard. Melisodes, again, we're in a different family. We're now in the same family that has bumblebees and honeybees. This is a species, it's either Trinotus or Agilis, that really loves sunflowers, both sexes. This is a male. You can see the really long antennae that give this genus the name longhorn bees. And this is Melisodes subilatus. Interestingly, all the records on the vineyard for this bee come from my front yard, where I have a massive population of Coreopsis lanceolata. And this bee must be capable of feeding on other things, because it was in the area when I had that Coreopsis get started. But given the chance, given Coreopsis as an option, that's pretty much what this bee will feed on. And finally, I think this is the last of my slides. Last of my slides with a photograph anyway. Melisodes duriellus, which is a late season aster specialist. And I had the opportunity of watching this female come in day after day for about 10 days in my yard and work a patch of Ionactis, of stiff aster, work it for about 10 or 15 minutes until she was full of pollen like this, fly off and come back and do the same thing a little bit later on. So very, very close relationship. She found a resource that was exactly what she was looking for, and she worked it until she had her nest fully provisioned. So to summarize a few things here, the idea of it just being pollination, being just a synergistic, mutually beneficial relationship isn't wrong, but it's simplistic. There's a lot of complexity going on, and it tends to hide from us the fact that in addition to being pollinators or plants, the plants and the organisms that are involved in pollination relationships have many, many other aspects of their lives that are equally important for their survival. And in addition to that complexity, there are divergent interests where flowers are after one thing and insects are after another. And sometimes the result is a really spectacular evolutionary innovation. And specialization, particularly with bees, is an underrated and little known, but very, very important feature. If you don't have the right flowers in your yard, you're not going to get the specialist bees. Specialist bees, because they're specialized, often are the ones that are most in need of conservation assistance. So you might want to, if you're interested in actually helping conserve pollinators rather than just having fun things to watch, which is a perfectly good reason, you should learn about what some of the plants are like goldenrod that support specialists, and hope that you can help produce resources for those. And finally, anybody can do things to help pollinators. You just have to plant flowering plants, and ideally you'd have a lot of variety, and it would be a season-long mix, and it would include a number of species in the important genera, 2, 3, 4 species of Solidago, 2, 3, 4 species of Symphiatrichum, which is one of the main aster genera on the island, and so on and so on. I can talk to you more about this in the future if you want. Our Natural Neighbors program at BiodiversityWorks, that some of you may already be involved with, lives for talking about those kinds of things. So there are plenty of resources. Don't hesitate to contact us at BiodiversityWorks to talk about some of these things. And thanks very much for watching.